Discussions in this show are for entertainment and educational purposes only and should not be construed as specific recommendations or investment advice. Always consult with your investment professional before making important investment decisions. Securities offered through registered representatives of Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer, member FINRA, SIPC. Advisory services through Cambridge Investment Research Advisors Incorporated, a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and SmartPro Financial are not affiliated.
Hey, Warren Payne, thank you so much for spending some time with us on SmartPro Radio. Your expertise in tax and trade policy and just government policy in general is so important right now as we're recording this in the summer, because everything we're talking about is either been in or has continued to be in the news cycle. So I know it's going to be impactful for our clients. So thank you for taking the time to join us.
Happy to do it. My pleasure. Looking forward to this. It's going to be a great conversation.
So I really want to start off with what's, it could be tariffs, it could be taxes, it could be trade policy, like all of that. Hopefully we can have some time to jump into, but I want to start off with what a lot of people are seeing in the news or have been for years, and it's China. How much of what we're seeing right now with tariffs, with trade policy, with this being such an alertness to moving towards a different policy and posture when it comes to trade is about China?
It's a great question. And China is the 800-pound gorilla in the trade policy room, right? It is also an area where trade policy can be pretty bipartisan. So there are other parts of what the administration's doing on trade that, struggles to get bipartisan support. But for the large part, the China piece is bipartisan. And this comes back to, I think, a fundamental assumption that the U.S. made almost 20 years ago now that has turned out to be largely false. And that presumption was that if the United States and the rest of the world brought China into the World Trade Organization, made them part of that multilateral institution, that institution, being part of that group, would coerce, incentivize, push China to operating its economy kind of in a free market concept, at least to a large extent, and to play by the rules that the WTO kind of frames out and everyone expects all the trading partners to follow.
Mm-hmm.
I think, quite frankly, as it turns out, that was just a wrong assumption. And China hasn't been playing by the rules. The rules of the game are difficult to apply to China. The analogy I like to use, if the world trade rules are everybody playing baseball, China's on the baseball field wearing a football helmet, pads, and cleats.
Mm-hmm.
And so there has to be a fundamental rethink. And that started really in the first Trump administration and is now continuing as part of the second Trump administration.
So being bipartisan almost scares me, because it seems like nothing nowadays is bipartisan. It could be the most radical, ridiculous common sense, and it seems like the two parties are going to fight no matter what, just because they can't seem like they're getting along, because of the fringe groups on both sides of the base will go nuts. And so for something being, hey, we can get both sides on board, like, this must be an actual real issue that has deep and problematic, continuation if it keeps going, that both sides are able to clearly see, hey, this is a problem.
You're right, and it is. I'll give you a couple examples. So during the first Trump administration, they imposed these special tariffs on imports from China. We call Section 301 tariffs. The Biden administration came in, not only did they keep those tariffs in place, in a number of places they raised those tariffs and actually took away some exclusions that the Trump administration had provided to say, okay, these specific products, you're not going to pay the tariffs. So to any extent, the Biden administration made those tariffs kind of more strict. During the first Trump administration, the administration really was pushing our trading partners to also get tough on China, right? It's one thing to build Fortress America, put up trade barriers here, but it's a little bit like squeezing the balloon. all that China exports got to go somewhere. So if the China exports go to the EU because we put up trade barriers, all that does is displace stuff the EU makes, and that sends all the EU stuff to the United States. So the Trump administration started pushing our trading partners like, hey, you have to get serious about China too. The Biden administration kept that same negotiation going. And so those are two great examples of here, to your point, in a very partisan atmosphere, concern about China remains a very bipartisan issue.
So China's playing a different game than everyone else when it comes to trade. Obviously, they have a different political structure than the vast majority of countries on the planet at this point. They're the closest thing to, if not a global superpower that is going to challenge the U.S. and continue to grow. Second largest economy after taking over Japan a few years back. Is China's growth with its population, its ability to manufacture, and just where the rest of the world at, do you feel like it's inevitable that China will surpass the United States, or is this a move to curtail that?
It is certainly a move to curtail that. There's no doubt about it. You know, China's got some very significant structural economic problems. They're either in or in the midst of a real estate crisis. Their population trend is going in the wrong direction, right? Even though they've eliminated the one-child policy, it's still a problem. Mm-hmm. They are vastly under-consuming, which is what's pushing them to go, concentrate on exports. And at some point in this process, it's going to be difficult for the Chinese government to continue to subsidize at the rate they have been. So, no, I don't think it's inevitable. Yes, this is part of a broader strategy to address that concern, though. But also, quite frankly, I think it's a recognition that while we may never be able to completely decouple the two economies, and there may be really good reasons for not fully decoupling, it's not a sustainable relationship the way it is. And really fundamental things have to change in order for U.S. economic interest to be protected.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm looking at it from a standpoint of everyday citizen in the U.S., I'm going, okay, I can get on board with China. That makes sense. Like there's something there. I kind of understand that. I understand, even if I'm not a policy expert, even if I'm not a trade expert, I understand they're probably playing a different game than we are, whether that's manipulating currency, how they look at trade deals, whether that's the theft of intellectual property. Like I've at least heard that over the last few decades, and maybe have seen it as well. Maybe I'm even in a town where my livelihood was directly impacted by companies moving offshore and other places. And of course, I lived through COVID and saw shortages of key materials, whether that's medicine all the way to construction materials or whatever. So I've seen it. But what the heck did Canada do? What about the EU? Why this blanket approach to every country? Because that could be hard for someone to understand. Now, there could be Team America, right? Like, hey, yeah, stick it to everyone else. And there's certainly people that are like that. But is there a more nuance here than just, hey, this is America, isolation, we're going back, putting up those walls, like you mentioned, like we can do everything here on our continent. We're okay. We don't need the rest of the world. And kind of that more bombastic Trump attitude that you may see or appeal to people. Or is there a game that's being played that most people aren't aware of right now?
It's a great question. It's one we deal with all the time, right? Because we're tariffing, quote unquote, our allies. And let's be clear, a lot of these countries are our allies from a national security standpoint. But at the same time, all of these countries are competitors in the commercial economic sense, right? It's like me and my little brother. We're family, blood's thicker than water. But when we start playing basketball on the court, we're coming for each other, right? So it's that kind of relationship. There are, I think, really two key motivating factors for why the administration is taking these actions against our quote unquote allies. One is, I'm going to go back to a point I made a minute ago, and that's this balloon effect with us getting tough on China. We get tough on China, we put up trade barriers, the China product flows to somewhere else, flows to the EU, flows to Mexico, flows to Canada. What does that mean? Well, they're displacing the product those markets produce. Those producers need some place to send their stuff. So out of desperation, they start sending their stuff at cheap markdown prices to the US, right? Steel, for example, is a classic example of this. The Chinese steel industry, massively over capacity, heavily subsidized, dumping product all over the world. And that's pushing, countries even like Vietnam and South Korea to have to ship steel to the United States to keep their plants open. Okay. So this goes back to, hey, we've got to do something with these trading partners to make sure, we don't have a loophole in what we're doing with respect to China. But then also with a lot of these countries, there are long running kind of trade frictions. And the US mantra has been to try to negotiate. Like we've had rounds and rounds of negotiation. And I think for the Trump team, they're looking into saying, we've had decades of these negotiations. We're doing the same thing over and over again, and we're not getting any new results. Yeah. And in some cases, it's gotten worse. So an example I give to people all the time, if you go back to the press conference in the Rose Garden with the president back in April on the Tariff Liberation Day, and he's waving around this report called the National Trade Estimate Report. That's a report the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative does every year, has been doing it for decades. I went ahead and made a table of the trade barriers identified in that report that U.S. exporters to Canada face. And I looked at what trade barriers were identified in 1995, what trade barriers were identified in 2005, what trade barriers were identified in 2015, and what trade barriers were identified in 2025, the latest report. About 2/3 of the trade barriers identified in 1995 are still there in 2025 because we just haven't been able to get the Canadians to actually change their behavior. And so, what's the old Einstein comment? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of idiocy. So there has to be a change in the dynamic. And in some cases, it's gotten worse, especially since like the 2008 financial crisis. That global contagion really knocked, especially the European economies, back heavily. And they went looking to find more revenue to support the social welfare state that they had built up. But they didn't want to tax their own companies. So they decided we're going to go after American companies. First, it was digital services taxes going after Apple, Google, et cetera. And more recently, it's been even broader than that. And, again, this is one of those things where the U.S. has stayed part of the multilateral negotiations. The U.S. has said, hey, guys, this is unfair. You're coming after us. And we've been stiff-armed. So now the administration is saying, fine, like we gave you warning. We told you this was unacceptable. You're still going forward. You should expect us to retaliate. And that's really where we are today. And I think that kind of explains why you see the administration being aggressive against quote unquote allies. But to your point, these aren't the kind of issues that show up at the 6 o'clock news, or if you're reading the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. All the China stuff does, but a lot of this other stuff kind of fades into the background and it's just not as well known.
No, that's very interesting. Even going back from, the financial crisis and how that spread to Europe, how it spread everywhere, but still recovering from that, and being in the financial world, we saw that when it comes to the stock market, right? That's our metric of measurement and what we're looking at. We saw, okay, it took, X amount of time, but you saw the emotional damage from clients. There's still clients in 2014, 2015 with their money sit on the sidelines going, I don't know what to do because I had this terrible experience. And it's just interesting seeing the long tail effects of that all the way into, 2025 going, hey, and you see that in the news all the time where companies are getting out, especially in the tech space from the EU on regulation and on giant fines. It's interesting knowing that some of that, if not all of that, lived initially from that financial, issue in 2008 that spread, and their economies and how they're set up. My my question from that too is, if I'm listening to this, could you give me an example of what's a trade barrier and why? So whether if we go back to the example of Canada, being that it's right here, it's relevant, it's a large trading partner. What is a trade barrier that a U.S. company may face if they're trying to sell their product in Canada?
Great question. And we always talk about in the trade policy space, we call a tariff barrier and a non-tariff barrier. Tariff barrier is pretty simple, right? It's a tax. When I export a product to Canada, that I pay the tariff, It makes my product a little bit more expensive in that market. Okay. Very straightforward. The non-tariff barriers are the ones that are really pernicious, because first you have to know they exist. You have to find them. And then you have to figure out how to unwind them and convince your trading partner to do so. So in Canada, for example, a huge, long-running, decades-long issue is access for American farmers to the Canadian dairy market. The Canadians have what we call a supply management program. It's a really think back to the kind of quotas and restrictions that the U.S. has largely eliminated from its agriculture sector decades ago. The U.S., so this has been a problem. It's been very difficult for U.S. dairy guys to sell their product into Canada. It was a real focus for the Trump administration when they renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA. And they really thought, quite frankly, they had made a huge breakthrough with the Canadians, because they said, what they did is they got the Canadians to commit and say, okay, no matter what, we will ensure that American dairy exporters get a quota. And that means you get a certain specified volume of access to the Canadian market. Okay, so we're going to give you, guarantee you get X many gallons. And the Trump administration thought, this is a huge breakthrough. We finally have guaranteed market access. Well, then the Canadians turned around and said, okay, we've agreed to this quota. In order to make the quota work, you usually hand out allocations. Like everybody gets, you find a stakeholder on the other side and say, okay, you get to access 10% of the quota, and you get 10%, blah, blah, you add it all up to get to 100%. Essentially, a little bit of oversimplification, but essentially what the Canadians did is they said, great, we're going to give all of those allocations to the Canadian dairy farmers. And guess what? The Canadian dairy farmers are like, great, we've got quota allocation. I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to buy American dairy. I'm a Canadian dairy farmer.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, all that work went into trying to open the Canadian dairy market. We thought we had a big breakthrough, and then the Canadians, changed, it wasn't spelled out. This wasn't in the agreement that the allocations had to go to a yogurt company or something like that. And so the Canadians, basically sleight of hand made that access almost meaningless, because they gave the rights to people who would never buy.
I have a question from that's a little off topic, but this is going to go into your time spent on the Hill with, members of Congress and what you've done in U.S. government. And this is kind of a pessimistic question, but it's one that I think everyone kind of knows, that wealth plays a big role in government. Or maybe that's a perception. Maybe you tell me, no, that's not quite how it is. But I'm going back to your example of the Canadian dairy farm and just that industry. And most people go, oh, this has got to be a small industry. This is not tech. We're not talking about something that's this massive. But, one of the richest men in Canada owns a huge part of the dairy industry. And so you wonder, is that directly coming from, hey, there's people with influence and power and money that are able to maneuver governments in a way that benefits them or their company? And how often does that happen? Or would you say, actually in the United States, we have some pretty big rules against that, and it's not as often as you think, but maybe not.
Listen, let's be honest. Big corporations, wealthy individuals have more resources to try to influence their governments. It's fact-like, right? But I think, to your point, the dairy example is actually one that shows that relatively small industries can be very effective in petitioning their individual members of Congress. Like if
Yeah.
you go talk to individual members of Congress from Wisconsin, from upstate New York, right, where these relatively small dairies are, but are right on the border of Canada, these members of Congress are super passionate about this issue. And their constituent that they care about might be a family farm with maybe 100 dairy cows, right? So, yes, large corporations, they have more resources to influence. But at the same time, members of Congress know their constituents. Those are the people who actually vote for them, right? And particularly when it comes to trade, I think the constituents, the small businesses, punch way above weight if you compare them to like corporate America.
That's interesting. I want to go kind of back towards trade and some of the ideas behind why we're seeing this big policy shift in trade. And I know you've mentioned in the past and talked about it that really a lot changed after World War II, where basically the world was in shambles. And the United States was on the other side of the ocean that could say, okay, we're going to rebuild Europe. We're going to rebuild these places. And we're doing it for two reasons. One, we have to rebuild these countries and these economies that are completely devastated. And we also have to save them from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union, who was having this massive land grab and influence grab at the same time. So it was these competing ideas. And, the Soviet Union's fallen. I know that China is now kind of filled that space recently of trying to assert influence in places around the world. We see that a lot in Africa. But I guess the question is has that rebuilding, did that go on too long? And was the United States really the ones that were funding this around the world? Is that the beginning of globalization as it's talked about now? Is that the undoing of this? Are we seeing that play out? And is this something that just went on too long?
That's a great observation to talk about how the post-war world order has changed. And you were right. We post-World War II, the U.S. led on a multilateral approach to global economic integration. And part of that was under the theory, countries that trade with each other don't go to war with each other. Okay, so that was number one. Two, to your point, we've got to help rebuild these countries that were devastated by the war because of thinking about it in the context of the Cold War, Soviet Union. But the third piece of this, and the one that I think is the piece that's under the most fundamental rethink in Washington, was the notion that trade liberalization was good for the U.S. in two ways. First, it opened other markets to U.S. exports, right? To your point, U.S. economy's cranking. We need some place for that stuff to go besides just consuming it ourselves. But The second piece to that was trade liberalization was good in and of itself because it helped lower costs for American consumers, right? Part of it is, hey, we can get avocados, bananas, coffee, cocoa, stuff we don't grow here. Critical minerals, okay, stuff we literally don't have in the ground in the United States. But also was more broadly applied than that. And so lower prices, good for American consumers. So to your point, post-World War II, we have these series of international trade negotiations that over time lead us to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is where we are today. And in each of those rounds of negotiations, the U.S. is negotiating with other countries, and everybody's agreeing to lower their trade barriers by a certain amount. And the U.S. is pushing to have countries lower their trade barriers so we can get better access for our exports. And in return, the U.S. is going to lower its trade barriers as part of the negotiation. But along the way, the U.S. says, and by the way, we'll be more aggressive about lowering our trade barriers because we perceive this benefit to U.S. consumers, right? Of lower prices, better selection, more supply chain options. And you've got the entire post-war period of these negotiations where every time we have one, the U.S. goes a little bit further than everybody else. So we get to today. The U.S. is a very open economy. Yeah, there are parts of our economy where, mainly in the agriculture space, where we still have some fairly substantial trade restrictions. But for the most part, like the average U.S. tariff on imports is very low, only a couple percentage points. Our trading partners who were less ambitious have much higher tariffs for the most part, usually at least double, sometimes triple or more. And they also have all these non-tariff barriers we talked about. So think about it this way. You're negotiating with someone, you're sitting across the table, and you want them to give you better market access. Well, what are you going to trade for that? The U.S. doesn't have a whole lot left to trade, right? In terms of that negotiation. Like, we don't have that many chits at the bargaining table anymore. So part of what's happening is, hey, the Trump administration says, we're going to do these tariffs and we're going to put them in place, but then we're going to have a negotiation with all of you because now we actually have more chits at the table. We have something you want. You want to get that old access to the U.S. market back that you had before we put these tariffs in place. Well, the only way we're going to get you to come to the table is if we now have these chits to negotiate with. And I think our relationship with the European Union is perhaps the best example of this, right? You saw the administration impose new tariffs on everybody. The European Union spent a month complaining to the administration, hey, these are inconsistent with your WTO obligations. These are unfair. These are discriminatory. You should just stop. You should take these down, repeal them. In the meantime, the U.S. is like, we'll repeal them if you agree to a negotiation about opening your market. And for a month, all the Europeans did was complain. And so Trump went on social media and said, great, you know what? We're going to go to 50% on everything from Europe. Well, all of a sudden that shocked the system, and now the Europeans are at the negotiating table. Whether we get to a successful negotiation, different story, but it's a classic example of how the use of tariffs is driving our trading partners to the negotiating table.
Discussions in this show are for entertainment and educational purposes only and should not be construed as specific recommendations or investment advice. Always consult with your investment professional before making important investment decisions. Securities offered through registered representatives of Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services through Cambridge Investment Research Advisors Incorporated, a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and SmartPro Financial are not affiliated.
I think if you look back on, Liberation Day at the beginning of April, if somebody said, oh, that was, that didn't feel like bringing chips to the table. It felt like somebody just flipping the whole table over and saying, we're going to restart, because it was so drastic. We saw from our end dealing in finance, 4 days, the market drops, 12%. And it was very reminiscent of March of 2020, where the market just, it was like a free for all. Like, when is this going to stop? And the volatility is all over the charts. The interesting thing is, if you look at it from the beginning of April to the end of April, it all kind of recovered in a very short period of time, where now, as we're recording this in the middle of summer, the market's positive in almost every area if you look at the indexes. And so it's just an interesting observation to go. It seems like, when Trump was up there and it has, here's the new tariffs, here's what we're charging, we're here, but it's half, and everyone's, oh my goodness. That was, for most economists, for most people, and maybe at least that's what we heard. Maybe you're going, well, from our end, it wasn't, but it seemed like that was the most aggressive posture that you could have. Like, oh, this is worst case scenario of what this is going to look like. And so it was a shock to the system. Did we reset global trade, flip the table, or bring more chips to the table? And what we saw was 3 weeks of major volatility and then a market recovery. Did we get were we able to reset global trade and that was the negative, or is there more to come that, hey, you know what, there's more pain down the stretch of this if we don't have some real movement on trade deals in the future?
Yeah. I kind of like the analogy of flipping over a table. I might steal that one. But yes, there's going to be more volatility. There's just no way to sugarcoat it. those tariffs, I think a significant reason why the market recovered the way it did is those tariffs were put on hold. They were put on hold until July
That's right.
9th. And let's be honest, like going back to your flipping the table metaphor, yeah, it was drastic. And I think people can make a legitimate argument that, listen, we just talked about how we spent all the decades post World War II putting this economic structure in place. There are lots of people who have built their businesses, built their supply chains around the structure that's in place. And they had every reason to do so because we've got, 60 plus years of history saying this is what the structure is going to be. And, it's not possible for companies to flip their supply chains overnight. You talked about the market can move quickly. Supply chains don't move quickly. They're the exact opposite of that. And so when the tariff on stuff from China is 145%, there are a bunch of small and medium-sized manufacturers in the United States, like as mom and apple pie manufacturers you can come up with, who still have one widget they got to get from China because it's the only place it comes from.
Yep.
And 145%, that's prohibitive. So they're freaking out. They're like, what am I going to do? And that causes a lot of concern. It causes a lot of chaos. And, there are good arguments that the administration underestimated just how much chaos it would create. You can also argue they recovered pretty quickly. They did a 90-day pause. That pause is scheduled to end on July 9th. That's a really important date because the administration will make a decision as to whether or not tariffs start to go back up again, beginning on July 9th. And to be honest, the negotiations are moving slowly. Right? We have a framework, kind of an MOU with the UK. That's the only one right now. The U.S. Part of the reason is the administration's pushing really hard for resolution of these issues that, as I described with my Canada example, that have been persistent issues for decades, right? Successive administrations, Republican and Democrat, have been pounding on away at these problems for decades. And this administration has given itself 90 days to try to resolve things that all their predecessors have struggled to resolve for 20 plus years. So it's not going to be easy. And I think there are going to be trading partners with whom the administration is going to get to July 9th and say, hey, you know what? We're not there yet, but you guys have been negotiating in good faith. Like, we appreciate how hard you're working. We're not going to bring the cudgel out and whack you. Mm-hmm. But there are going to be countries where they're going to say, listen, you guys have been trying to rope-a-dope us. You're slow walking. You're just not getting it. We're going to have to cold cock you and bring the club out. And then I think there'll be countries in between. Well, they'll say, listen, we made a little bit of progress, but not enough. So your tariffs are going up, but maybe not all the way to that Liberation Day level.
How big are these teams that are doing the negotiations? Because it seems like the news puts it out as it's one person or two people, right? It's like that strongman idea of like it's this one person has to get it all done and they have to negotiate, 100 trade deals in 90 days. And you're going, well, that's impossible. But what's the apparatus behind it?
So it's a great question. And there are certainly more than one person. You've got what we call the three principles. You have the USTR, which is Jamieson Greer. You have the Commerce Secretary, is Howard Lutnick. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. Those are the guys. Those are what we call the principals. But before those guys ever walk into a negotiating room, there are hours and hours of what we'll call technical level negotiation. And that's the staff at the Department of Commerce, the staff at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, literally people whose job is negotiating trade agreements. They're the technical expert on the rules. They understand the industries. And they will spend hours and hours and hours in these technical level meetings before those principals ever walk into the room. Now, just to be bluntly honest about it, there's a bandwidth problem. Like, we can't, even with all these really experienced, skilled staff, we can't possibly negotiate with every country at the same time.
Yeah.
And so there's about, if you talk to the administration, they'll say there's 18 or so countries, particularly if you count the EU as one country, that they are prioritizing. And that's where the focus is. It's countries like the EU, it's countries like the UK, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, like Vietnam, countries that account for very large shares of the overall U.S. trade deficit. And that's where the priority focus is.
Do you feel like that 10% blanket tariff is going to stay? Or is that another threat?
My operating assumption is as long as the courts don't strike it down, that 10% baseline tariff is probably here to stay. And listen, there is a legitimate legal question as to whether the statute the president is using actually provides him with the authority to do that. We've had one court ruling said, no, that's not what that statute's for. It's in the appeal process. I expect this is going all the way to the Supreme Court. We're not actually going to have a full resolution of this until sometime in the fall, perhaps late fall of this year. But that's plenty of time for the administration to use that authority, for example, on July 9th, as we just talked about.
So as of recording this, the Treasury data shows that tariffs collected right now are on pace to be $190 billion. And that's over $2 trillion over a decade. Looking at that, is the idea to pay down the debt? Because that seems to be, going back to our example of April, in that 90-day pause. The 90-day pause was great. And a lot of people are going, why exactly that happen? Well, one of the things that was happening that day was Treasuries, U.S. debt was really having a hard time. And that move, people say, well, it was coincidental, but it seems like maybe the debt markets were saying, hey, we don't like this policy where this is at right now. There has to be some change. And so U.S. debt now is becoming a real big issue, it seems like. And as we're recording this, we're in the middle of still the negotiations on a spending bill and where that's going to go and how that's going to lay out. And it seems like this is going to be a very big issue. If it's already here, but it's going to continue to be an issue into the future.
You're absolutely right. And this is where kind of the tax and trade policy starts to overlap. Because there is a lot of discussion about how this much higher levels of tariff revenue than we've ever had, in the post-war era, is going to help address both funding the government and paying down the debt, right? But, let's be honest, there's a little bit of friction here because these tariffs are also supposed to be about a negotiating tool, negotiating leverage, right? We just talked about chips on the table. Tariffs can't be both simultaneously, right? If tariffs are going to raise revenue to help offset federal spending and address the deficit, they have to be, if not permanent, then long lasting so you can collect the revenue. But for tariffs to be an effective negotiating tool, you have to be willing to let them go. And that's why you get a little bit of this dichotomy in the administration's posture. I think that 10% baseline tariff, people are kind of looking at that as, hey, that's part of our solution to how we offset federal spending, how we address the deficit. Those higher tariffs, those Liberation Day tariffs, those are hey, this is the negotiating leverage tariffs. And then on top of it, we have all these other tariffs that are what we call product specific: steel, aluminum, autos. Got investigations ongoing on lumber, copper, semiconductors, heavy trucks, aircraft, right? So those tariffs, that's a big chunk of that revenue you just talked about. An awful big chunk of that is coming from these product specific tariffs. But yes, and then to your point about the government spending and tax bill, yeah, there's a lot of talk about, hey, when Congress is looking at, does this bill increase or decrease the deficit, take into account this tariff revenue, even if it's not like part of the bill itself.
Do you feel like the Congress has the ability to address the debt issue? Do you think there's leadership there or not?
I mean, they're certainly making a go at it, right? As we sit here and talk, the House and Senate are wrestling over this tax and spending bill. The current bill, as we sit here and talk, reduces federal spending by $1.6 trillion, which is, if not the largest, one of the largest one-time planned reductions in U.S. federal spending, right? So I think what Congress would describe it as, it's a down payment on the problem. It in and of itself doesn't fix the problem, but it's at least a down payment on trying to fix the problem.
You spent a lot of time working with members of Congress and know a lot of people that have either been in that world or still in that world. Do you feel, let's see how to ask this nicely. Do you feel energetic? Do you feel like, man, there's some really sharp people here that I feel really great about the future of our country, the problems we're going to have, we have smart people to be able to address them? Or do you feel, man, this is not great. We don't have, this is not our best and brightest that are representing our states, our districts, our people in Congress?
Yeah. And I think it's a great question, because a lot of what people see in terms of their member of Congress is that 30-second clip on the news or on Twitter or social media. The way I describe it is, Congress is like a microcosm of the whole country. And so we have the full continuum of America in the Capitol building.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, that means some people are really smart. Some people are really empathetic. Some people bring really cool experience to the job. Some people are there just to gather attention. And some people aren't necessarily great team players, right? So we've got that full range. And that's not a partisan thing, because I could point to members in every one of those groups on both sides of the aisle. But I feel like, particularly in some of the key leadership positions, and I'll say key leadership positions on both sides of the aisle, there are some really smart, thoughtful members who I think would love to have more flexibility to do some of the more creative bipartisan stuff. Unfortunately, we're in a really partisan environment right now. Part of this is we got election outcomes people weren't anticipating. There's a little bit of shock. Part of it is, as we've been talking about with trade, the administration's really breaking norms. And trade's not the only place the administration's breaking norms. And so there are folks on both sides of the aisle that's rubbing the wrong way. Sure. So, it's a complicated answer. All the pieces are there. The hope is that we get to the environment that allows those smart, successful people to be successful.
Yeah. No, that's interesting to think. I remember in in a government, class, talking to a professor that spent some time in Washington, and he talked about, what you see versus the reality, a lot of times are different. And he talked about members of Congress that would, and senators that would get together on both different sides, and they'd, Friday have a glass of scotch and talk, and we're, like, in a way that's different than we would maybe perceive, because what I see is just everyone hates each other. And that's what it looks like. And then that trickles down to, your local communities, that, your families. And it just seems like that is the norm. And I just wonder if that world has shifted where that actually isn't, that is the reality in Washington, or if because of the environment we're in, with access, with, hey, you get one clip taken out of context, you get one smile or one thoughtful conversation with somebody else on the other side, you could get primaried, coming up. And so you just can't show that. But it's actually, there is friendships and dialogue between members of Congress of different parties, of radically different ideas, or if it's cutthroat and I don't know. I would rather it be the opposite of what it seems like right now.
Listen, I will tell you, there is still that kind of behind the scenes, when the camera lights aren't on, bipartisan relationships, having these reasonable conversations. But to your point, because of social media, And quite frankly, because of some other structural things that have happened, it's harder to do now. And so when I first started working in Congress as a staffer, for example, it was still fairly common for members of Congress to move their family to DC, right? Because these guys are, the members of Congress are basically here a total of 9 or 10 months out of the year.
Yeah.
And it's not great to be away from your family in, multiple weeks every month. And so they would move their family here. What that meant, though, is kind of their kids were in school here for a good chunk of the year. Their kids were playing Little League here or soccer here for a good chunk of the year. And you'd have members of Congress meet each other on weekends at the grocery store or at the kids' soccer game or at, the school play. So there was an environment that, encouraged, if not fostered, kind of more personal relationships. To your point about primaries, that became a really big primary issue kind of the early 2000s. And today, it's the exception for members to move their family to DC as a result.
Interesting.
So what happens is members fly into DC on a Monday afternoon. They go to votes. Tuesday morning, they go into their party conferences. So it's all Republicans in one room, all Democrats in another room. Then they go to their committee hearings. The TV lights are on. They've got to do their thing for the TV, get their social media hit. And they do this Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday morning, and then they fly home. Right? And so that opportunity for them to engage in behind the scenes, no cameras on, conversation, there's less time for it. It's harder to find time for it. And to be honest, when I was up there, we used to say, actually, one of the best things we could do for members to get to know each other was to send them on a trip. Like if they're going to be on a bus or on an airplane and they have to sit next to each other, they don't have a choice. They got to talk to each other.
That's right.
And so this is one of those issues where kind of the gut reaction from back home in the district where, hey, we want our guy to be, he's our guy, he's our gal. They need to be here. They need to live here. We don't want them going on these junkets. It makes sense at a first level, but when you start to unpeel it, it actually is counterproductive.
I like that. It's like the offsite meeting is still a thing. Get out of here. People, yes, that's fantastic. You find that in business a lot of times. We just had an offsite meeting for our key leadership, and that's when, relationships and bonds are formed and you can understand people at a different level, and it's incredibly impactful. It's funny that all the way into federal government, that still works. It's that human connection that's needed that gets lost. As we wrap up, I have a kind of closing question for you. And because you're an expert in trade, you're an expert in tax, you're an expert in all these areas, you have so much experience in DC, and you know how it works. I think all of these kind of questions, with the exception of maybe one, because it's a little more futuristic, but are relevant right now and fit into your wheelhouse of expertise. But I want to ask it in a way of, what do you think of these 4 or 5 topics moving forward? So maybe not August, September, but if they're not addressed or they're not looked at in a way that's creative or smart, could pose long-term economic or structural issues in the United States that somebody has to have the guts and leadership to look at. And so the questions are our current tax policy in the United States, and we see things all over the place, from abolish the IRS to flat tax to where we're at now with no tax on tips, or wherever that may lead, right? Like it seems to go both ways pretty hard. The tariff situation that we have right now and talked about, like, are these tariffs here to stay? Is the 10% going to be around? Is this just part of the norm that, tariff revenue has to come in to pay for, our potential welfare state that's being created right now with, Social Security benefits and Medicare and Medicaid and all the things that are defense spending, all those that are on the budget? Is it long-term trade issues? Is it the national debt? Or is it the potential of and the growth and this new kind of cutting edge revolution of AI and the potential of job loss or economic creation that could come from that? where do you look at now and you kind of look 4 years, 5 years into the future and go, this is going to be an issue if we don't get our arms wrapped around it?
Yeah. So from my perspective, I see a lot of places where these issues all become intertangled and interwoven, right? You need a good tax and trade policy that is enough to make American corporations competitive, right?
Yeah.
So that they can compete against whether it's heavily subsidized Chinese producers, whether it's, the EU, which is throwing up regulatory barriers intended to protect their nascent industries at the expense of American companies, right? So tax and trade 100% intersect there. So we've got to get that right. My own personal view is that something like the tax system we have now is the right way to go. I think there are arguments to be made that there's probably more revenue you could squeeze out of a couple different places to help deal with long-term debt and deficits. But you don't want to get to a point where the federal government is taking 25 cents out of the dollar from people, right?
That's right.
I think that's too much. And that then both of those two things lead to this question of long-term debt and deficit. So I'm an economist. The way I look at things is what matters to me less is I'm less concerned about the absolute value of the debt and more concerned about the ratio of debt to GDP and what our net borrowing costs are. And we've got to get to a point where, that ratio of debt to GDP is shrinking. And it's a ratio. So you got to attack it from both ends. You got to start to squeeze the spending, slow down the rate of spending, and need to accelerate the rate of economic growth. So we're right back to, hey, what's that right balance of tax and trade policy? Mm-hmm. And then you layer on top of all of that, like technological transformation. And I think back, the pace of technological transformation, and in particular, what it's meant for the workforce and what it's meant for whether we have the right tax policy, just over the last 2 years, it's hard to really think about it. Funny story, I've got a 21-year-old daughter, I think it was probably 6-7 years ago. She goes to work with her mom. Sitting in her mom's office 7 years ago is a typewriter. She's like, what is that? I don't know what that is, right? Whereas I learned to type on a typewriter. But that's kind of a microcosm of how fast the technological revolution is overtaking the workforce. It has great benefits because it means our worker productivity is going through the roof. It also has negative impacts. Like, let's go back to that trade impact. We talk about, hey, we need tariffs to protect core U.S. industries. One of them is the U.S. steel industry. And employment in the U.S. steel industry has shrunk dramatically. Is some of that because of trade? Yes. But some of that's technology. If you went into a steel plant in the 1950s and 60s, there are hundreds of guys shoveling coal, shoveling coke, right, making the steel mill work. You go to a steel mill today, and there are a couple guys still in the silver suits, but most of the guys are in an air-conditioned control room operating a computer where robotics are making everything work.
Yeah.
Right. And so we've got to figure out, and that goes back to what are we doing in education? What are we doing? Is our tax policy providing the right benefits for apprenticeships? Like, I'll tell you, one of the big fights in tax policy right now is, hey, we have all these tax incentives for going to college. Do we need to put all that money there, or should we have more money going to apprenticeships and trade schools? Because there aren't enough welders, there aren't enough electricians.
That's right.
And so all of this stuff becomes interwoven. It makes it super important. It also makes it really hard to solve because it's like the world's biggest, most complex Rubik's Cube.
Mm-hmm. Well, Warren, this has given us so much to talk about, to think about. You've enlightened us on key issues. And I really appreciate your time spending here on Smart Pro Radio and talking to our clients and to our listeners. Thank you.
My pleasure. Happy to do it. Glad it was helpful. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Smart Pro Radio. I really hope you enjoyed it. And make sure you subscribe because we put out new content on the first Monday of each month. We'll see you then.